Hello, everyone. My name is Armin Kunz. I'm one of the dealers exhibiting here, and I got the task to introduce Susan Tallman at the print fair, which I think will be a very, very short thing because I don't think that people who are in the print world need to be introduced to Susan Tallman. So I can start off saying I want to introduce her as a personal friend and as someone whom I've heard decades ago as this person who wrote about prints and many other things. She also wrote for a magazine called Art on Paper when that still existed. And what I then learned about her, that all she really writes about is writing on prints. So she's really into prints. She then, when Art on Paper unfortunately folded, set up her own magazine, Art in Print, which ran glorious 10 years. And it was a very, very important new organ, new, different, less staid organ for the print world. And she ran it in this sort of woman mode of running it, publishing it, writing for it, editing it. And also, as I told her yesterday, in each issue, it was a bi-monthly issue, writing an editorial introduction, which talks about a variety of issues, and each and every one of them were absolutely brilliant. In the end, Art in Print had its run, the glorious 10 years, and now I'm happy to say she found so many different publications and outlets, and she's also a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books, and outed herself as someone who is just a brilliant art critic who can write about other things, but not only prints as well. So with these words, since she's at the print fair now, I want to welcome Susan Tallman on her talk about her own curated show, which everyone can see when the two paths that divide at the beginning come together again. And you can talk all about that show anyway. So Susan Tallman, thank you.
That's going to be very hard to actually live up to, but we'll do what we can. So when Jenny asked me to curate something for this little corner in the print fair, I thought about what is it that I like most about the print fair. And what I like most about the print fair is that it's one of the very, very few places you can go and see 15th century art next door to something that was printed last week and everything in between. Usually those things are divided up, right? So I thought, well, I needed a rubric that would allow you to do that. And I also need, at this point, to give a huge mea culpa and note of thanks to all of the people who helped me on this through my areas of sublime non-expertise. So you know who you are. Armin is one of them, but there are others throughout the fair. And if I embarrass myself here, it's entirely my doing. It's not their fault. So I'd been writing about portraits for other venues, and I'd been thinking about how we are really, neurotypical brains are hardwired to pay a different kind of attention to human faces than we pay to other kinds of visual information. And this is really cool. So that's a hook. Faces are a hook. But portraits can be problematic because if we can or feel we should identify the person in the portrait, we may like or loathe the person in the portrait, and that can really get in the way of looking at what you're actually seeing visually. So, Tronies. Tronies is this word for, and those of you who know 17th century art, and I know you're sitting in front of me, you can take a very quick nap now and just go to sleep. In 17th century Netherlands, Dutch art, tronies was a word that was used for faces or heads when it's not a portrait of blank. right? When it's not an identifiable person. So if you go on Wikipedia, they'll tell you Vermeer, girl with a pearl earring, Rembrandt in various, silly headgear. All of those things are considered tronies, but it's actually an incredibly loosely defined thing because it was simply a word for a face. So they used it all the time. And then we've come to think of it in this kind of very specific sense of a face that's not an identifiable person. The National Gallery at the moment in their Vermeer show gives the definition as an informal head study modeled on a real person, yet primarily intended to study expression, texture, costume, and accessory. It's different than a portrait. It's not commissioned. They were done on spec. And it was really an occasion for the artist to have fun, to play around with defining character or playing with cool materials or playing dress up from the costume chest, whatever. But that's kind of why it segues so nicely into modern ideas about what artists do, is because we expect them to be generating their own ideas all the time, not just pleasing the person who's sitting in the chair in front of them or the person who is writing the check for the person who is sitting in front of them. So that idea of the Troni as a space to have fun, I thought was sort of a lovely idea. And so that is the deep, very, very intellectual guiding principle behind the selection of the works that are in that show. And there's no big thesis. It's really just an occasion to look. In the show, things are organized by how things looked good on the wall. Right now, I'm just going to run through things in chronological order because being trained as an historian, that's my default mode. And I'm just going to mention like little bits of background information about each of the objects in case it's of interest to anyone. So the show chronologically kicks off with this pairing of, I need my clicker, those two guys, which is a Jan Liefens etching from about 1631 and the Rembrandt copy and adaptation of it. So this is where tronies pretty much start in most art history textbooks. You've got Liefens, you've got Rembrandt, they're hanging out together in Leiden, they're sharing a lot of the same ideas, and they start doing these heads. And Liefens does these 4 etchings where he's playing with expression, age, youthfulness, funny headgear, which, by the way, is like a real theme here. 4 years later in Amsterdam, Rembrandt copies those 4 etchings. They're reversed left-right because he's copying from the print, not from the plate. And he livens them up and elaborates them. One person gets a feather in their turban and just turns them into Rembrandts. Obviously, in all of this, the dreaded word Orientalism plays a part because some of what they're doing is just costume chest stuff, but they're interested in exotic costumes. They're interested in drawing cool materials. They have no clue about how these things would necessarily have been worn or used or what they meant or anything else. This is a space for play. And the moment we are very sensitive to how Orientalism segues into exoticism, segues into imperialist agendas and rationalization of ethnic hierarchies and all of that. We aren't there yet historically. We're still in the just mucking about phase. I don't know if you can see this given the sun, but you can get them okay. So in 1699, I think it was, Flemish painter Jean-Baptiste van Moor accompanied the French ambassador to Constantinople as part of his entourage and was commissioned to do 100 portraits of people in Constantinople, of the Ottoman court, of the various types of people that lived in what was probably the most cosmopolitan city on the continent. And then these 101 portraits get redone as engravings, often in very luxurious hand-colored versions. And these things are distributed throughout Europe. And it's a bit of a cheat in terms of the Troni rubric, because he didn't really care about the faces, as you may be able to tell from looking. He really cared about the costumes. But when this was distributed in Europe, it became enormously influential in terms of interior design and clothing and accessories, and most of all, turbans. Everybody loves a turban. So this then becomes a trope that gets incorporated into European tronies. So this, which if you go to the wall, you will see it's tiny. The engraving itself is about yay big and extraordinary. Just if you can, get up close and squeeze your eyes at it. It's as labeled in the plate, it's a portrait of the artist's wife. The artist was the most famed reproductive engraver of his generation, Raphael Morgan. This is his wife, Domenica. And it would be a kind of straightforward portrait, except for the fact that he's actually lifted it from an Angelica Kaufman painting where Domenica posed as the muse of tragedy, or just as tragedy. It's not even a muse. She is tragedy. Her sister-in-law is comedy. And so his wife, who was tragedy, is now back at being his wife in a sense. But at the bottom, it makes the engraving acknowledges that, he's done the engraving, but that the initial design is by Angelica Kaufman, which points you back to the tragedy thing. So you have this sort of slippage of, is this a specific person? Is this something else? And she's wearing a turban, but it's a different turban than the one she has in the painting. So this idea of the face that is a specific face, but not a specific face, is that when we call it a troni, we generally mean something distinctly European, but the idea obviously is not centered in any particular place or time. So I was curious to get some ukiyo-e prints that did the same thing. And two of the most popular genres for Japanese prints were the beauties and the kabuki actor portraits. And both of those trade on this same kind of ambiguity as to what you're looking at. Are you supposed to read it in terms of the role? Are you supposed to read it in terms of the individual? And this is even more complicated because of Japanese laws that came and went about what you were allowed to portray and identify. So there were laws against depicting women and putting their names on it unless they were courtesans. There are laws against naming an actor in a particular role. And the publishers and artists got very clever about putting in clues so that you could figure it out without it being named. But there's this whole play that goes on through them. And so this artist, Keisei Eisen, specialized in beauties. And a lot of the beauties are full figures, you've all seen them. And he specialized in beauties that were faces. And the faces all kind of look more or less the same, but it's all personalized and differentiated by all of these external clues, by the accessorizing, by the images that are put on behind, by the nature of the pattern on the kimono fabric. All of these things were clues for what illusions are being drawn, who the person being depicted might be, and what you might know about them. And now for a change of pace, because we're going chronologically, we get James Ensor. And so you may or may not be able to see down at the bottom at the left, it in Ensor's handwriting, it says l'ancestre. So he's titled it as the ancestor. Little etching of an old man. But in other ones, he titles it as Old Man. And in other ones, he titles it as Portrait of a Priest. But we actually know that the sitter is Sweden's foremost mycologist, a guy named Elias Magnus Friese, whose image was widely distributed. Now, why he chose to copy this, why he then chose to fudge the identity, is anybody's guess. He did when he was at school in Brussels. He was friends with a couple. The husband was a physicist and the wife was a mycologist. So maybe he saw it there. Maybe he did this as a gift for her, or maybe he just thought it was a really intriguing face and decided to play with it and divorce it from wherever it was from previously. But yeah, so you get to go from being a famous mushroom hunter to sitting in Solander boxes described as somebody's ancestor. So this is this famous, some of you may know this print. This is this famous laboureur, very atypical for laboureur, who's mainly known for his engravings, this woodcut from 1912 called Lassitude. And lassitude was a subject that was very popular at the time. Everybody was doing pictures of languid young women flopping about here and there, seemingly unable to keep themselves vertical. And what's interesting about the laboureur is he doesn't do the body. He doesn't give you anything but the face. And to do lassitude in a face is a much harder task than doing lassitude of a person flopping on a bed. And he comes up with this kind of extraordinary solution of the louvered blind eyes. The standard reading of this is that this is an opium addict, which I'm not questioning the standard reading. What do I know? But when I look at it, the one thing that strikes me is the way the chin is up, which it looks like somebody with a VR set on, which is to say that they're like navigating a world that we can't see at all, but they're fine. They're doing whatever they're doing and getting on with their life. So this is a Japanese woodblock from 1915, which is odd for any number of reasons. It's not, most Japanese prints come in a couple of standard sizes. The papers came in standard sizes, the blocks came in standard sizes. This is the size of a postcard. It's not the usual size. And it was meant to be flogged at the theater as a kind of substitute for the photo repros that had come in by then of kabuki actors. So that's odd. The other thing that's odd is obviously this is not a standard kabuki play character, Queen Artemis. And thirdly, that it's actually an actress in the role as opposed to an actor, because although kabuki had started out with female troupes in the 16th century, women were banned from it by the 17th century. And since then, all kabuki roles had been played by men. And the actress was a woman known as Sade Yako, who became globally famous. She traveled the world. She toured the States, toured Europe. This is William Nicholson's portrait of her from a 1902 portfolio that also included the Pope and Teddy Roosevelt and Thomas Edison, which gives you some sense of kind of like what her degree of fame was. And of course, she's in this funny position, which is I have a picture of her in Japan playing a Western character. The minute she gets to Europe and the States, of course, she represents the exotic East, and that's the representation of her. So it's this, again, sort of slippage of identities that goes on. Simultaneous with that kind of thing, we get this kind of thing, which, as we say, nice French girls with English artist husbands dressing up and accessorizing in what we might call Asian fusion style. Just as a fashion statement. And Brockhurst, loved doing fiddly little etching, and in a very, what was by then antiquated mode, lovingly doing the embroidery and the little curlicues on the fireplace, so on and so forth. And that's kind of what Tronies were originally designed to do, was to give people space to play with that kind of drawing. Let's see, what's up next? George Bellows. This gets back to the joy of funny headgear, which is, this is his wife and his 2 daughters. But they're published as lithographs. So the presumption is this is something that's made for, as it were, a mass audience, for people who do not know the individuals here. And one of the ways that you make that clear is by shifting the balance between the sitter and the accessories. And so these are being drawn indoors. Why are they in hats and coats? There's really there's no common sense behind it, but it's to make the picture. So it's, the individual gets subsumed into what works for the artist in terms of creating a picture. And he goes to the trouble to call out the hat in each of the titles in case you didn't notice. So in 1920, Tokyo's first Western-style theater staged a production of Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. And this is the kabuki actor Morita Kanya, 13, as Jean Valjean. That's the one, needless to say, on the left. The one on the right is from a few years later, part of a set of 12 kabuki actor portraits. And the artist, it's actually the same artist who did the Queen Artemis, working from photographs, from those theater bromide photographs that were handed out. Isabel Bishop, I really wanted to have in the show, even though, again, it's kind of cheap because it's full figure instead of just faces. But she, spent years in the 20s and 30s doing these tiny little etched studies of people, New Yorkers, seen on the street, mainly around her studio on 14th Street. And they're too anonymous to be portraits, but they're too individuals to just be a type. Like, this is the poor person. This is the city slicker. She pays incredibly close attention to body language, but also to costume. And they also make you realize what we have lost in terms of street life by virtue of everybody giving up hats. How much more fun would it be to be out there? Everybody was wearing hats. And this was an artist I didn't know before. This is one of the discoveries of this. Reba Helfont, who was a WPA artist, social realist. She taught printmaking at Harlem Arts Community Center, the FPA project. Bob Blackburn was one of her students. And she drew working people from life. She did New York, which is where she lived, but also Ohio and Pennsylvania, coal country, those kinds of places. She doesn't identify anybody by name. These are individual people. She's doing them from life, but they're always named in terms of their demographic, which puts them kind of in the category of the Van Moor paintings from Constantinople. This is this type of person, even though it's clear that you're looking at an individual. And they're both sort of have this educational mission. The Van Moor pictures are, an Audubon guide to ethnic types. But in this case, it's this sort of education in social awareness and the people you don't normally see, and economic injustice. This is Hugh Steers, and I thought dressing up the pleasure of dressing up is so much a part of what Tronies are about. And This was a lithograph that he made just before he died at the age of 32 in 95. And in the 80s and 90s, he had painted these very beautiful, very tender pictures of gay life in a sort of almost like those Vuillard family scenes, that kind of beautifully lit interior that, it's just so incredibly closely observed. And so this lithograph, which seems just to be about like the fun of having a nice dress and a nice pair of shoes and standing in front of the mirror, except at the same time he's painting these, not that one, these paintings where the white heels are paired with a white hospital gown, and it's this sort of dressing up as a kind of salvage operation. All right, I'm going to have to wing this one, Niels. my notes on the Knut Ade are gone. So Knut Ade is known as a musician and was part of the Danish punk band, fairly well-known Danish punk band called Soul Sort, and he's still a musician, and he's just put out a new album. But he's also a visual artist, and his pictures, some of them are named portraits of people, and some of them, like this one, are, I keep looking at it going, I'm sure I should know who that is, but apparently not, or at least no one has been able to ID it yet, that hover in this space between, is it the styling that makes you think that? Is it the way the face is presented that makes you think that? Or is it actually somebody living in the back of your head? Hung Liu, who you probably all know, recently passed away. Born and raised and trained in China in social realist painting, emigrated to the States as an adult, and did all of this work addressing intercultural identity and also longitudinal identity, the degree to which we remain the same person over time or do not, the role of memory and self-preservation, like how we think of ourselves over those kinds of changes. So on the right-hand side is her official portrait, one of her official portrait series, where she went back and did pictures of herself in the roles that were kind of imposed on her by governmental structures. So as a proletarian, that's this one, as an immigrant, as a citizen. Then the one on the left, Butterfly Nun, is drawn from an old Chinese photograph, which she's done fairly straightforwardly, but then basically accessorized the photograph with a butterfly and a grouse that's taken from a 17th century Buddhist ink painting, the gold Passepartout, so that it again shifts it into this other space. Nicole Eisenman, Fleet Week. And this is probably as close as the contemporary ones come to being a classic Troni, because it is so about the pleasure of the drawing, but it's also about the accessories and the physiognomy and the expression and the tattoos. And you get the sailor as a sort of social type, but also as an individual person. Kerry James Marshall, who almost never does actual portraits of specific people. When he's done portraits, they've been of people that we don't actually have a visual record for, like Nat Turner, where he's reimagining historical figures. But he's incredibly adept at inventing people who you think are real people and giving them this sort of presence. He does this thing where the larger paintings, compositions, he uses posable dolls, which he dresses up in clothes and he lights from a particular size and so on and so forth to ensure continuity as he's moving around them and lock everything down. But that's why the clothes always look so odd, so the woman's clothes were made from tracing paper, and the man's clothes were made, he thinks, I thought it was a tie, he thinks it's an old sock. So things with small patterns, but they still end up too large on clothing. So the 40 Fridas project by Ellen Heck is a large-scale project in which she invited women and girls to dress up as Frida Kahlo in whatever way suited them, picking the clothes or the accessories that they wanted to wear. And obviously, Frida Kahlo is like known for her self-portraits, known for her accessorizing, known for this kind of assertion of individual identity through that kind of what you choose to wear, how you choose to present it. So you ask somebody to dress up as somebody who's famously individualistic, and you're already starting to combine things. Then there's the fact that the combination of etching and woodcut rings obvious bells in terms of Mary Cassatt's prints. So there's an echo of that. And Mary Cassatt, of course, was pulling off of ukiyo-e prints. So there's a further echo of that. So you've got all of these layers combined into these very winning portraits, often of children. For another series called Fascinators, she took pictures of kids and photographs, and then drew them wearing hats made out of paradoxical forms like Mobius strips, right? Things that are very are real but don't obey the way we think about 3 dimensions. So you're going from a flat image to make it seem 3-dimensional and applying this 3-dimensional form that doesn't make sense really, even though we understand how it works. And it's a formal task on the one hand, but it also gets into questions of character. So most of them were from photographs, but one was from a portrait of by Antonio Lopez Garcia's 1972 painting of his daughter Maria. And no matter how the artist tried, she couldn't get the hat to sit right on the head. It just wouldn't work. So the print is called Maria Who Refused to Wear a Hat. Rob Pruitt's figures, again, are not real people. They're derived from real people, but they aren't specific individuals. And he often gives them very extravagant headgear. He's done Dogon sculptures and radio towers and Totlin's Monument to the Third International as hats. Print started out as a test plate, but then sort of morphed into something much more substantial. And the one that's in the show is the one on the right, where the hat has the conical shape and the bird crown of the beaded Yoruba crowns, if you know those. This is Enrique Chagoya doing headgear as ethnic identity, all using himself. So just like Rembrandt did the self-portraits in different modes, this is him as a Middle Eastern male, as a Carmen Miranda model imaginary Latina, as the middle-aged Stanford professor of art that he is. It's just a send-up of the whole notion. Stephen Chambers, British artist now living in Berlin, did these. These were a spin-off. He did 101 portraits for the court of Redonda. Redonda being a completely unpopulated piece of rock in the Caribbean that does, however, have a king. Well, it used to. So that the most recent king was the Spanish writer Javier Marias, who died in September. So I don't know who's the king now. And it has a court. But these are all in this was at the Venice Biennale. These are all these portraits of the Duke of this and that, and it's all invented. And then the prints were this spin-off. They begin as drawings where he's solving drawing problems, and then they gradually become people, and then he looks at the people and he gives them the title. The whole thing is inverted from standard portraiture. So the piece on the right is Kenny Riviero's White Fitted. There were so many black hats in this show that a white hat seemed really necessary, not to mention a baseball cap, which is maybe the headgear most associated with identity and people making personal statements that about what club they belong to politically or sports-wise. And I like the fact that the face kind of disappears and you're really left looking at the hat instead of, and everything around it, all of the chatter. Kate McCrickard normally for years has done very, very beautiful drawings of things that are close, nearby, her children, the people who hang out at the dive bar nearby far too early in the day, the people playing football on the corner, the people in traveling circuses, so on and so forth. When I asked her if she had something for this show, she decided to make something new. And she decided to run with that idea of when moments in time when extravagant costume became this kind of liberating force. So she was thinking about Italian mannerism on the one hand and Boy George and Duran Duran on the other hand. So it's this kind of homage to 1980s new romantics, club life done in exquisite dry point. And this is Colin Lee. If you happen to be a Chinese, Irish, American artist, you probably spend a lot of time thinking about the complicated nature of identity and how identity intersects with visual appearance and what kind of assumptions are made and how things, and all of those sort of rifts that occur between things. But the specific prompt for this was a conversation with a friend who was very concerned over his lack of internet presence when he went to Google himself. So the artist in this case decided to Google himself and then do a composite portrait from the image search that turned up. And if your name is Colin Lee, that covers everything from academic researchers in Singapore to business people in Hong Kong to an English football player. And so pieces of that came into this, but also one of the Colin Lees out there, I think Australian, is a voice-over artist who, instead of putting up his photograph, put up an oscilloscope reading of his own voice. So if you look really, really hard, I'm going to give you a hint, lower right-hand corner, you will see the oscilloscope tracing even made it in there. So that is all I got to say. And I just hope that it's actually more fun to look at than it was to sit in a hard chair for this long and listen. Thank you.